the second part of our podcast about the future of Hong Kong, we are joined by Ambassador Kurt Tong. Ambassador Tong was the Consul General of the US to Hong Kong and Macau between 2016 and 2019, and previously served as the US Ambassador for the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Ambassador Tong. I wanted to start off the discussion by talking about, right at the beginning, in 1997, this system of one country, two system that exists in Hong Kong. What do you see as the parameters of one country, two systems? And do you think they've been upheld in the past 20, 23 years?
Sure. Well, I think the intent of the framers of the one country, two systems system was to provide the maximum amount of autonomy to Hong Kong that was consistent with China's understanding of its sovereignty. So the basic design, as you know, was for Hong Kong to look after its own affairs to a very considerable extent, and the phrase was high degree of autonomy for Hong Kong, with reservations set aside for foreign affairs and for defense. So Hong Kong has no army, obviously, and no military of its own, and it's part of China, but to a very significant extent, the intention was for Hong Kong to manage itself and look after its own policies and way of doing business, and also for how society operates. I think that to a very significant extent, that goal has been achieved over the last 22 plus years. In recent years, there's been some slippage in terms of how that framework has been implemented, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and it's quite complicated. But I think as an overall assessment, the idea itself was a good idea, and it's been successful, but that there is increasing concern about how the framework's being implemented, which is, I think, a major reason why you're seeing the political instability of the last year or so.
And how does this concept of the basic law, which is often used by protesters, how does this fit into the whole one country, two systems idea?
Well, I think protesters are expressing concern about how the mainland in particular, but also the Hong Kong government, have been implementing the concept of one country, two systems. And if you'll recall, the trigger for the protests last year was a proposed piece of legislation that would have allowed extradition of criminals or fugitives from Hong Kong to mainland China for trial, and that there was distrust in Hong Kong about the judicial system in China, and therefore people were concerned about that. And the government was not able to explain it, how it was going to be implemented in a way that provided sufficient confidence for the people of Hong Kong to allow it to go forward. And then when the government decided to push forward with the bill anyways, there were a lot of protests. So what it showed is that Hong Kong is a very different political environment from mainland China. It has freedom of expression as enshrined in the basic law, freedom of assembly, and people have both the right and the privilege, and in some ways the responsibility to speak out and operate in the Hong Kong system and have their voices heard about matters of governance. That's very different from the system in the mainland, and it's those differences that start to create friction over time and require a recommitment from everyone to the original framework of one country, two systems.
So how do you kind of propose that the government responds to criticisms and communicates better with protesters about what the extradition bill is actually trying to achieve, and what in your view is the extradition bill trying to achieve?
I think the extradition bill, as a fundamental idea, that if somebody commits a crime in China and goes to Hong Kong, that shouldn't be an escape hatch or a safety zone for people who've actually committed crimes in mainland China. But how that is implemented, and so the government was making statements about how it could use Hong Kong courts to guarantee that anyone extradited from Hong Kong to the mainland would be a legitimate case, and that upon reaching the mainland they would have a fair trial. But the safeguards that were being discussed, I think, just didn't convince people. And so the only, at the time, I'm now not in government and just a private businessman, but at the time, my advice to the Hong Kong government was to go slow and take more time to listen to concerns and then think about ways to reassure people rather than push forward quite so rapidly. I think that was good advice, and instead things kind of got out of hand, and a lot of other frustrations with the situation in Hong Kong started to build into the conversation about the extradition law, and it became a generalized political protest as opposed to just something specific about that law.
Could you tell us a bit more about these safeguards that you just mentioned that are present around the bill?
Well, the government can speak for itself, but the safeguards that were explained to me at the time were that a court in Hong Kong would review whether the case that was being brought had prima facie evidence and made sense as a case. But there were concerns about that, like could the court in Hong Kong then query the court in the mainland that was making the extradition request, and then also concerns about how trials would be conducted upon after transfer of the fugitive, and so the concerns that built up were not just ones of political activists, but rather also people in the business community were expressing concern about this, that it might be used by their business partners against them in a business sense. So it became a big problem.
So I wanted to talk a bit more about Chief Executive Carrie Lam herself and how you think she dealt with the protests and with the unrest and the instability from the beginning right up till the withdrawal of the bill in September 19, and even with the protests that have continued after.
Well, Mrs. Lam is a thoughtful, intelligent, very, in a technical sense, very well prepared for the job. My concerns at the time in 2019 were that whether she was taking into account all of the voices that from the city, and so this is I think a common statement about Mrs. Lam's handling of that particular issue, and she herself, in retrospect, said that she should have taken into account more of the concerns of the Hong Kong people and business community, and even the foreign business community, which were being expressed about the legislation. So I think she's, obviously she's in a difficult position. It is a tough job to be reporting to the mainland government, but also and appointed by the mainland government, but elected by Hong Kong and representing the interests of the Hong Kong people. It's a tough job. And I don't feel like I'm in a position to offer advice given the difficulties and the complexities of the job. But I do think that it's important for leadership in Hong Kong generally to understand that the people of Hong Kong see themselves as being in a society where they have a voice, and carefully listening to those voices is very important.
And what do you think the economic costs of the protests have been and will be in the future? And do you think they have harmed Hong Kong's position as a financial hub?
Well, I think that the immediate cost is quite obvious in that because of the street activity, there was a big decrease in tourism and even business travel to Hong Kong in the fall of in the autumn of 2019, and certainly that showed up in the numbers in terms of economic growth and the situation there. Hong Kong has, as you know, very strong financial sector, and very important globally significant financial markets. It is also a tourism center, a place where business is conducted on a regional basis, and also a shipping and logistics centers. And that tourism and business meeting activity set is a very important part of the economy. And the protests made that kind of activity difficult. No one wants to get caught without their flight being canceled or things like that. So it was a concern. But you also asked the longer term impact, and I think that the concern of international investors and people that do use Hong Kong for business or do business with Hong Kong is again, back to this one country, two systems, is the viability of Hong Kong as a place that will reliably operate according to a different set of rules and norms than the mainland. And if that understanding and system can be maintained, then I think Hong Kong will continue to be an attractive place to do business. If people start to feel like Hong Kong is just another Chinese city, then I think the city will lose business. And really, it's quite, when you come down to it, it's quite simple. That the competitive strength of Hong Kong is the fact that it's part of China but different from the rest of China, and that competitive strength is based in the autonomy that it enjoys in terms of its legal system and its way of doing business, including socio-political aspects of Hong Kong society. And so then maintaining that autonomy is very important.
And how do you think the international community responded to the protests and to the instability in Hong Kong throughout last year? And do you think the US and Europe could have done more for the protesters and more to tackle this instability?
Well, there's kind of a limited reach for foreign governments in impacting what's going on in Hong Kong. I think the international government community, the governments of Europe and the United States, made sympathetic statements about the protest movement instinctively as much as anything. The United States puts a very strong value on democratic systems and rights and the human rights of people to express themselves peacefully in public. And so while the US government occasionally criticized the violence, I think the main thrust of US government comment and European government comment was to express concern about what the protesters were seeking, and also support for their right to do those protest movements, and concern about the overall trends with autonomy which were creating the protest movement. How much impact those foreign statements have, I'm really not sure. I think more important really is whether the international business community feels like Hong Kong is a good place to do business, and whether the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government realize how important that international business community perspective on Hong Kong is to Hong Kong's future. I've said a number of times, my personal belief as a business person now is that the value of Hong Kong is that it brings together a vibrant local economy together with investors and resources from the mainland and investors and resources from outside China, and mixes them all together, and they create a dynamism which is extraordinarily valuable to everybody concerned. If you take any one of those pieces away, the mainland interest in Hong Kong and the foreign interest in Hong Kong, then eventually the dynamism of the economy and society will start to unravel. So I think it's important for China to listen to foreign voices, not necessarily government voices. They find it irritating that governments are speaking out, but talk to the business community about what they value about Hong Kong and how to keep it viable.
So of course, owing to the COVID-19 pandemic, the protests themselves have calmed down slightly, but of course Hong Kong still remains completely divided along these generational party lines. How do you propose Hong Kong goes about overcoming this kind of impasse between the protesters and the pro-democracy wing and the pro-Beijing wing? And how does reconciliation happen in Hong Kong in the future?
Well, again, it's not necessarily my problem to solve, and I'm not a citizen of Hong Kong, but my gut instinct is that something along the lines of the people in decision-making positions in the Hong Kong government, in the Legislative Council, and in the mainland government, doing something along the lines of a listening tour. There were attempts at that made by Chief Executive Lam last fall to do some town hall type meetings and things like that, and it didn't quite work. The voices were too shrill in response to her, and there was too much of a sense of tension and violence in the air, even to really conduct a good dialogue. But perhaps now, while things are still relatively quiet, would be a good time for that outreach to take place, and for maybe mainland officials as well as Hong Kong officials to really think what can be done to reassure the Hong Kong public about the viability of Hong Kong's autonomy. Certainly the things that happened in the last couple of weeks were not in that direction. They were not in the direction of listening to the Hong Kong people. They're in the direction of telling them what they should think. And that's just not, I'm not sure that's going to work with the way that Hong Kong society actually operates and the depth of concern that people have.
And how do you think the pandemic in general will affect not just the future of protest in Hong Kong, but also the economic future of Hong Kong?
Well, I think the COVID pandemic has revealed the weaknesses as well as strengths of a lot of societies, and really challenged them. And Hong Kong's not an exception. So Hong Kong, as I said, it needs people coming and going in order to be vibrant economically. And one of the things that the coronavirus has really hurt is travel and the willingness of people to move and expose themselves, because the more people are moving, then if they're infected, the more people they infect. It's very simple. And governments have done, pretty much every government, as I understand it, on the planet has put restrictions on travel and the movement of people. That's going to really make things challenging for Hong Kong. Hong Kong does have good online technology-based communication systems, and so that will help a lot. But that will be challenging. But I think that's not necessarily unique to Hong Kong. Any city that thrives on connecting other people, and I would include New York in that. I think it's going to be very difficult for New York City to recover its full range of economic activity that it had prior to COVID, or London, right? For things really to come back and be what they were, it will take really serious effort in reassuring for their health safety. So I think that it's a practical challenge. I think that Hong Kong has done very well in dealing with the coronavirus. The government hasn't gotten a lot of credit for that, but the Health Bureau, as far as I can tell, has really done a good job of testing, contact tracing, and treatment, the basic fundamentals of pandemic response that the United States is really struggling to accomplish. And that's to its credit, and I think that will help Hong Kong. But Hong Kong is not a manufacturing center, so it's not just a question of reopening factories. You need to see people moving. In relative terms, I'm still more concerned, say, about the United States and our economic recovery than I would be about China or Hong Kong or some of the other economies of Asia, which seem to be better positioned.
Mm-hmm. My final question to you before we take questions from the audience is, as we look now to 2047, are you optimistic about the future of Hong Kong?
Well, I'm hopeful. I think that there, certainly the trends in the over the last few years, the mainland government's attitude towards Hong Kong, I think, has been gone in a negative direction. But I don't think it has to continue that way. And perhaps they're responding to external statements, or a sense that concern about the impact of all of this political vibrancy in Hong Kong on the situation inside mainland China. But I'm hopeful that as nations of the world all struggle to think about how to recover from the coronavirus and how to grow their economies and societies in a healthy way, that that China writ large will look to Hong Kong again as an example of how to organize and how to operate and take advantage of the strength of the city. So, and that then leads toward respect for Hong Kong's autonomy and trying to maintain rather than blur the one country, two systems distinctions. So I'm hopeful, but I do think that things could go either direction, and it really requires thoughtful leadership in order to capture the full benefit of Hong Kong, both the Hong Kong people, but also for other participants in that kind of miraculous little city.
Turning now to our first member's question. This one is from Andrew at Hartford, and he asks, considering the long-standing decline in media freedom in Hong Kong since 1997 and the disappearance of 3 booksellers in 2015, do you think that the right to free speech was in fact better upheld in Hong Kong under British rule than today?
Well, I'm not sure whether that's the proper comparison, right? When Hong Kong was British, it was British. Now it's part of China. The question is how close to the ideal level of press freedom can Hong Kong maintain? There's been some backsliding, as the questioner points out. With the bookseller incident, was very worrisome. The decision, I guess that was 2 years ago now, to disinvite a senior Financial Times editor because he was doing standard journalistic work in a sensitive area. Those kind of things are definitely in a negative direction. But on a broad scale, and if you look at the international measures of press freedom, Hong Kong still stands out as a good place for media to operate, certainly relative to the rest of China. So the goal should be to maintain that. And comparisons to before and after British rule, I mean, sure, people can make those, but really, that's a 20-year-old story now.
Our last question is from Lucian at Pembroke, who asks, if Hong Kong was to peacefully transition to Chinese rule in 2047, do you believe that it is in China's interest to leave Hong Kong's social and economic systems relatively unchanged, given that its current makeup makes it so attractive to wealthy global investors and big corporations as their base in Asia, sorry?
Oh. Yeah, well, short answer is yes. I think, the interesting thing about 2047 is there is a reference to 50 years in the agreements that set up one country, two systems, but it establishes it as a minimum. So Hong Kong will enjoy a high degree of autonomy for at least 50 years is the basic idea. There have been from time to time people hoping that, well, even after 2047, this is a long time from now, 25 years away, that this system of having a different set of rules in Hong Kong could be maintained. Who knows? I don't have a crystal ball. I think there could be some value in that for the way of life of the Hong Kong people, but also economically, as your questioner points out. And there's also been some thought. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but I don't know if you've heard of this idea of the Greater Bay Area initiative for the regions near Guangzhou and Hong Kong. the Pearl River Delta is another way to refer to that region. And the concept is to have Hong Kong and Macau and Guangdong province become more interoperable economically. And there's various ways of doing that. One is by building bridges and roads, but another would be to have common sets of rules for conducting business. If that were the case, you would think that naturally that would go in the direction of Guangdong becoming a more internationalized, globally open business environment than the rest of China. And there's opportunity, I think, for Hong Kong to continue to influence how business and society are organized in China. And that's what I would like to see, because I think that the kind of systems and dynamism that Hong Kong enjoys are more appropriate for the 21st century than a more controlled state-led system. So who knows? We'll see. It's gonna be. I'll be an old man in my rocking chair by the time these questions are answered. But I'll be very curious to see what happens.
That brings us to an end to the discussion today. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ambassador Tong. It has been a pleasure hearing from you.
Sure, thank you. I enjoy the opportunity. Thanks very much.